close your eyes. Take a slow breath in and let it out even more slowly than you took it in. Feel the surface beneath you. The weight of your body, heavy and warm, your shoulders releasing, your jaw unclenching. Your hands open and still. Tonight, we are going to meet someone. Not a stranger, exactly. Someone closer than that. Someone whose face, if you saw it across a fire, you would almost recognize. Whose eyes, looking into yours, would hold something you know. Something ancient and familiar and deeply, uncomfortably human. We are going to meet the Neanderthals. And I want to tell you right at the beginning that almost everything you think you know about them is wrong. They were not the brutish, hunched, club-wielding cavemen of old cartoons and old science. They were not stupid. They were not primitive in any meaningful sense of the word. They were not failed humans, evolutionary dead ends, nature's rough drafts discarded when something better came along. They were people. Not people exactly like us, but people in every way that matters. They buried their dead. They cared for their sick and elderly. They made jewellery. They made music. They painted caves. They felt grief and love and curiosity. They looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. They lived on this earth for nearly 400,000 years. To put that in perspective, our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. And we have only been doing what we call civilization, farming, cities, writing, for about 10,000 of those years. The Neanderthals were here long before us. They mastered ice ages and survived catastrophes that would have ended lesser species. They spread from Portugal in the west to Siberia in the east. They hunted mammoths. They crossed mountains. They built fires in the deepest winters and kept their families alive. And then, approximately 40,000 years, they were gone. Why? That is one of the great unanswered questions of human prehistory. Tonight, we will sit with it. We will not pretend we have all the answers. But we will go as deep into the mystery as the evidence allows. Breathe slowly, let the day dissolve. And let me introduce you to our closest cousins, the people who walked this earth before us, beside us, and within us. Because here is the thing that makes this story truly extraordinary. They are not entirely gone. Right now, inside your body, between 1 and 4% of your DNA, if you are of non-African ancestry, came from a Neanderthal. You carry them with you, in your immune system, in the way your body responds to cold, in the thickness of your hair and the shape of certain bones. The Neanderthals did not simply disappear. In all very real biological sense, they cut of us. Tonight, we find out who they were, before they were named. The Valley of the New Man. In the summer of 1856, in a limestone gorge in western Germany called the Neander Valley, Neanderthal in German workers quarrying for limestone broke open. A small cave about 20 meters above the valley floor. Inside, they found bones. Not the bones of a bear or a cave lion, which would have been unremarkable. These bones were clearly human or almost human. A skull cap, thick and heavy, with prominent brow ridges unlike anything they had seen. Arm bones, leg bones, ribs, all robust, powerfully built, subtly wrong in ways that the workers could not quite articulate but could clearly sense. They brought the bones to a local schoolteacher named Johann Karl Fulrett, who recognized immediately that they were significant. He passed them to a professor of anatomy named Hermann Schaffhausen, and the debate began. Some said the bones were simply those of an unusual modern human, perhaps a soldier, perhaps someone with a bone disease. One scientist, a Prussian pathologist of considerable reputation named Rudolf Virchow, insisted that the bones were simply those of a modern man who had suffered from rickets and arthritis. But others saw something different, something older, something that suggested human history was far longer and far stranger than the prevailing view, which, in 1856, was still largely shaped by a biblical timeline of a few thousand years, could accommodate. 3 years later, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And suddenly, the bones from the Neander Valley had a context, a framework. They were not a diseased modern human. They were something else, something that had once been alive and was now extinct. A different kind of human, one that evolution had produced and then, apparently, discarded. The Neanderthal had entered human consciousness, and for the next 150 years we would get them all. It's a caricature. Let your breathing slow. There is no hurry here. We have all the time in the world, and the night is long and quiet. In the decades following the discovery of those first bones, as more Neanderthal fossils were found across Europe and the Middle East, a picture emerged. Not accurate picture as we now know of even. And vivid pictures, once established, are difficult to correct. The picture was built largely on a single reconstruction. Published in 1909 by a French scientist named Marcelin Bull, Bull had access to a remarkably complete Neanderthal skeleton found at a site called La Chapelle aux Saints in France. And from that skeleton, he constructed an image of the Neanderthal that would dominate public imagination for decades. Stooped, shuffling, head thrust forward on a thick neck, knees bent, unable to fully straighten, heavy, brutish face, small brain, or at least a differently organized brain. A creature barely above the apes. Something that grunted rather than spoke. The image appeared in newspapers and magazines and natural history museum dioramas around the world. The brutish caveman dragging his knuckles through the Pleistocene mud. There was just one problem. Bull's reconstruction was wrong. Badly, fundamentally wrong. The skeleton he was working with, the old man of La Chapelle aux Saints, as he became known, was an elderly individual who had suffered from severe arthritis. His spine was deformed by disease, his joints were damaged. He had lost most of his teeth long before his death, and had clearly been cared for by others who kept him alive despite his inability to chew tough food. The stooped, shuffling posture Bull described was not the natural posture of Neanderthals. It was the posture of a sick old man with advanced osteoarthritis. But the caricature had taken hold, and it would take most of the 20th century and a revolution in genetics and archaeology to replace it with something closer to the truth, what they actually looked like. Let me describe them to you now, not the cartoon. The real thing, as best as modern science can reconstruct it. A Neanderthal adult standing before you would be immediately recognizable as a human being. 2 legs, 2 arms, upright posture, fully upright, not stooped, a face you could read. Eyes that met yours. But there would be differences. Clear, striking differences. The skull first. The forehead would slope back more than yours, with heavy brow ridges pronounced. Shelf-like projections of bone above the eyes, giving the face a somewhat different profile. The back of the skull would be rounded differently, projecting backward in a shape called an occipital bun. The face itself would protrude forward more than a modern human face, what anatomists call prognathism. The nose would be large, very large, by modern standards. Wide and prominent. This was almost certainly an adaptation to cold. Dry air, a large nasal passage, could warm and humidify the frigid air of Ice Age Europe before it reached the lungs. The body would be short and extraordinarily stocky, barrel-chested, wide-hipped limbs relatively short in proportion to the torso. This is the classic cold-adapted body shape, the same logic that makes Arctic peoples today tend to have more compact body proportions than tropical peoples. A compact body retains heat more efficiently, but powerfully, overwhelmingly, massively muscled. The bones of Neanderthals show the marks of muscle attachment so pronounced that modern human bones look fragile by comparison. A Neanderthal in peak condition would have had the musculature of a professional strongman, but natural, built through a lifetime of hunting large animals in difficult terrain. Their brains, on average, were slightly larger than ours. Not smaller, slightly larger, differently shaped, more elongated, where ours is more globular, but larger in raw volume. They were not small-brained. They were not dim. They were, in terms of raw cognitive hardware, our equals or very nearly so. How long they walked the earth. Before we go further into who they were, let me give you a sense of their time. The earliest Neanderthals, or rather, the earliest members of the population that would eventually become Neanderthals, appear in the fossil record in Europe about 400,000 years ago. These early forms are sometimes called pre-Neanderthals or archaic Homo sapiens, depending on which scientist you ask. The terminology is contested and frankly confusing, so let us simply say the Neanderthal lineage is very old. For comparison, the anatomically modern humans who eventually replaced them, us, appear in Africa about 300,000 years ago. So the Neanderthals are, in a meaningful sense, the older species. They survived multiple glacial cycles. Ice ages came and went. The climate of Europe swung between warm interglacials not unlike today and brutal glacial periods when ice sheets extended as far south as northern France. The Neanderthals lived through all of it. They retreated south into refugia during the worst cold and expanded north again during warmer periods. They adapted. They persisted for 400,000 years. To feel the weight of that number, consider all of recorded human history, from the first writing in Mesopotamia to this moment, is approximately 5,000 years. The Neanderthals were here for 80 times that length of time. They are not a footnote in the story of life on Earth. They are a chapter, a long, rich, remarkable chapter that we are only now beginning to read properly. How they lived. Hunt. Let me take you somewhere specific. Northern Spain, approximately 50,000 years ago. A valley in what will one day be called the Cantabrian Mountains. Though no one has named them yet and never will in any language we would recognize. It is autumn. The air is cold and sharp, much colder than a modern Spanish autumn because the climate is in a cooler phase. Your breath fogs. The forest around you is dense and dark pine and birch and oak, the undergrowth thick with fern. You are a Neanderthal hunter. Part of a small band of perhaps 20 to 30 people, extended family, probably, connected by blood and long familiarity. You have been tracking a group of aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, massive animals, shoulder height to a tall man. With horns that could disembowel a lion. You have been tracking them for 2 days. This is not a casual pursuit. This is sophisticated, coordinated, intelligent hunting. You know the landscape. You know where the aurochs graze and where they drink. You know the ravines and cliff edges and narrow defiles that can be used to funnel prey into a killing ground. You have done this before. Your father taught you. His father taught him. The spears you carry are not simple pointed sticks. They are carefully made composite tools, wooden shafts with stone points. The stone knapped to a razor edge using a technique called Levallois that requires considerable skill and forward planning. You did not make these this morning. You made them days ago, in camp, carefully, choosing the right flint, striking it with exactly the right angle and force to produce the precise flake shape you needed. You approach the aurochs heard from downwind. You move slowly, using the trees for cover. The other hunters are positioned, you know where they are without looking. Because you planned this together this morning, communicating in whatever language your people use. A language we will never hear and cannot recover. And then, the moment, the sprint, the chaos and noise and the terrifying proximity of those enormous animals. The thrust of the spear, close range, risking everything. The Neanderthals were not distance hunters. The evidence of their bones shows that they have healed fractures lots off them in patterns that match what modern rodeo riders and professional athletes sustain. Injuries from close, violent physical contact with large animals. They hunted big game at close range, with courage and coordination and skill, and they succeeded. For 400,000 years, they succeeded. The fires they kept. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. Let the images of the hunt fade to something quieter, something warmer, or fire. The Neanderthals made fire. This is beyond doubt. The evidence is everywhere in their archaeological sites, hearths, burned bones, charred plant material. They controlled fire as reliably and as skillfully as any modern human group. But what does that actually mean in terms of who they were? Fire is not simply a survival tool. Fire is a social technology. Fire changes everything about how a group of people lives together. Around or fire, you are safe from predators. Around or fire, you can process food. Cooking makes calories more available, makes tough meat tender, destroys parasites and bacteria. Cooking is, some researchers argue, one of the most significant factors in human brain development because cooked food provides more energy to the brain for less digestive effort. But beyond safety and nutrition, fire does something else. It extends the day. Before fire, the darkness that came with sunset meant the end of active social life. After fire, the group could gather in the darkness, warm and lit, for hours beyond sunset. And what do humans, what do social, intelligent, language-using creatures do when they gather around a fire in the evening? They talk, they tell stories, they teach, they plan, they argue and reconcile and fall in love and grieve together. They pass knowledge from the old to the young. They build the social bonds that hold a community together. The Neanderthals had fires. They had evenings around those fires. They had all of this. We never will. But they talked, or communicated in whatever way was natural to them, which may have included language in something closer to our sense of the word than was once believed. They cared for each other. This is the thing that moves me most when I think about the Neanderthals. They took care of each other. We know this not from speculation but from the bones themselves. In Neanderthal archaeological sites around the world, we find the remains of individuals who, by any calculation, should not have survived as long as they did. The old man of Les Chapelles-aux-Saints, the same skeleton that Bull misread so badly, had lost almost all his teeth years before his death. He had severe arthritis. He could not have hunted. He could not have gathered tough plant foods. He could not have survived on his own. But he did survive, for years, by the evidence of the bone healing, which means that other members of his group fed him, processed food for him, chewed it, perhaps, or softened it, carried him when he could not walk easily, kept him alive long past the point where survival without help would have been possible. At a site called Shenadar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal burial was found where the individual had been born with a withered arm, probably useless, from early childhood or birth, and had also sustained injuries to the skull and eye socket that would have caused blindness in one eye. This individual survived to middle age. Decades of survival with disabilities that, in a group that did not care for its members, would have meant death in infancy or early childhood. These are not isolated cases. Across the Neanderthal record, we see healed injuries, we see elderly individuals. We see people who survived conditions that required the sustained support of others. The Neanderthals practiced care, not as a cold strategic calculation, keeping useful members of the group alive for what they could contribute, but apparently as something more unconditional. Care for the sick, care for the old, care for those who could not contribute to the group's survival in any obvious practical way. If that is not humanity, I do not know what is. The art they made. Let me tell you something that was not known when I was young and that changed everything when it was discovered. The Neanderthals made art. Not clumsily, not accidentally. Deliberately, thoughtfully, beautifully. In a cave called Ardales in southern Spain, researchers have found paintings on the cave walls red ochre, applied to stalactites and cave formations, creating abstract shapes and patterns. The paintings have been dated using uranium-thorium dating, which is more reliable than radiocarbon dating for old samples. The date came back as 65,000 years old. Diese Time. There were no modern humans in Europe, none. Homo sapiens did not arrive in Europe until approximately 45,000 years ago. The only humans in Europe 65,000 years ago were Neanderthals. The Neanderthals painted caves. In another Spanish cave, La Pasiga, ladder-shaped symbols painted in red have been dated to more than 64,000 years ago. Again, Neanderthals. In Cueva de los Aviones, also in Spain. Researchers found perforated shells with holes drilled through them, stained with red and yellow pigments in ways that suggest they were worn as jewellery or used in some kind of symbolic display. Dated to 115,000 years ago, long before modern humans arrived. The Neanderthals wore jewellery, they collected pigments, they decorated their bodies and their world with symbolic marks. What does this mean? It means they had an interior life, a sense of beauty, a desire to create and adorn and express. These are not the activities of creatures operating purely on instinct. They are the activities of minds that could hold abstract ideas, that could imagine how something might look, could plan to make it look that way, could value the result for reasons that went beyond immediate survival. The Neanderthals were symbolic thinkers. They were, in a meaningful sense, artists. Did they speak? This is one of the most debated questions in all of paleoanthropology. Did the Neanderthals have language? We cannot hear them. We have no recordings, no writing, no direct evidence of their communication. What we have is indirect evidence, and that evidence is increasingly pointing toward a capacity for language that was at minimum sophisticated and may have been fully comparable to our own. First, the anatomy. Sehioidbone small, delicate bone in the throat that anchors the muscles used in speech has been found in Neanderthal fossils, and it is shaped essentially like ours. The reconstructed Neanderthal vocal tract based on skull base anatomy. suggests a capacity for a range of sounds similar to modern humans. Second, the genetics. In 2007, researchers discovered that Neanderthals carried the same version of the FOXP2 gene that modern humans carry. FOXP2 is sometimes called the language gene, though that is a vast oversimplification. What it actually is a gene involved in the fine motor control of the mouth, tongue, and jaw, the precise muscular coordination that speech requires. Modern humans with mutations in FOXP2 have severe language impairments. Neanderthals had the same version of this gene that we do. Third, the social complexity. Everything we know about Neanderthal life, the coordinated hunting, the care for the sick, the transmission of complex tool-making skills from generation to generation, implies a level of social coordination that is very difficult to achieve without some form of language. You cannot plan a coordinated hunt across a wide landscape using only gestures. You cannot teach the complex Levallois flint-knapping technique without some form of verbal instruction. The current consensus among researchers is not that Neanderthals had no language. The question is how similar their language was to ours. Some believe it was essentially equivalent. Others believe it was simpler, perhaps more concrete, less capable of complex, abstract thought. But the idea that they communicated only in grunts has been thoroughly abandoned. They spoke to each other. We simply cannot hear what they voweled. The Ice Age world. Let me paint you a picture of the world the Neanderthals inhabited. Not the worst of the glacial periods, the ice ages were not constant deep freeze, but alternated between glacials and warmer interglacials, but a typical period somewhere in the middle of their long tenure on Earth. Europe looks nothing like the Europe you know from maps. To the north, the ice. During glacial periods, a wall of ice stretches across what is now Scandinavia, down through Britain, covering northern Germany and Poland. The tree line, the boundary beyond which forests cannot grow, sits where Paris is today. South of the ice, a landscape unlike anything in modern Europe, open steppe stretching endlessly. Dry, cold, windy, not quite a desert, but with little of the lush forest that covers much of modern Europe. Through this landscape move extraordinary animals. Woolly mammoths, their curved tusks sweeping the ground as they forage, woolly rhinoceroses armored and dangerous. Cave bears, larger than any modern bear. Cave lions, larger than their modern African cousins. Spotted hyenas, horses, reindeer, bison, aurochs, giant deer with antlers spanning for meters from tip to tip. This is the world the Neanderthals hunted. A world of megafauna, large, dangerous, nutritious animals that could feed a group for days if a hunt was successful. And further south, in the refugia where the climate was milder, the Iberian Peninsula. Italy, the Balkans, the Middle East, a richer, more forested world, Mediterranean scrubland. Oak forests. River valleys lush with plant life. Coastal areas with access to marine resources. The Neanderthals were not limited to one type of environment. They were generalists, adaptable, resourceful, capable of living in the cold open steppe and the warm Mediterranean coast and the forested river valleys of Central Europe. This adaptability is itself evidence of intelligence. A rigid, instinct-driven creature cannot thrive across such a diversity of environments. Only a flexible, learning, culture-transmitting creature can do that. What they'd. We know what the Neanderthals ate from multiple sources, the chemistry of their bones, which records the isotopic signatures of different food sources. The animal bones found at their campsites, many bearing cut marks from stone tools, and, occasionally, preserved plant material from their teeth and from hearths. The picture that emerges is of highly capable, flexible omnivores. Meat was central to their diet, particularly in northern Europe during cold periods. The isotopic evidence from some Neanderthal specimens places them at the very top of the food chain, eating as much or more meat as wolves and hyenas. Large mammals, mammoths, rhinoceroses, horses, bison, reindeer were their primary prey. But they were not obligate carnivores. In southern Europe, in warmer periods, plant foods made a significant contribution. Analysis of dental calculus, the hardened plaque on their teeth, has revealed starch granules from plants, including cooked starchy roots and tubers. They gathered and processed plant foods. They knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. At some sites there is evidence of shellfish consumption. At others, evidence of fishing. At a site in Gibraltar, Neanderthals appear to have exploited marine resources extensively: mussels, limpets, marine mammals, even birds caught from clifftop locations. And here is something that surprised researchers when it was first discovered. Analysis of Neanderthal dental calculus from a site in Spain found evidence of plants with no nutritional value, plants that are, however, known for their medicinal properties. Yarrow, groundsel, ephedra plants used in traditional medicine by human cultures around the world. Were the Neanderthals using medicinal plants deliberately? Were they treating injuries and illnesses with herbal remedies? The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it fits a broader picture of a species with substantial knowledge of the natural world, knowledge accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years of living intimately with their environment, their tools. The stone tool technology associated with the Neanderthals is called the Mousterian industry, named after a site in France. It is sophisticated. Deliberately, impressively sophisticated. The centerpiece of Mousterian technology is the Levallois technique, a method of preparing a stone core in a specific way so that when struck, it produces a flake of predetermined shape and size. This is not something you discover by accident. It requires understanding the three-dimensional structure of stone, planning the sequence of preparatory strikes and executing each step with precision. Experimental archaeologists, modern researchers who try to replicate ancient stoneworking techniques, find that mastering Levallois takes months of dedicated practice. It cannot be learned simply by watching. It requires instruction, feedback, correction. The Neanderthals taught this technology to their children across generations, maintaining a consistent, recognizable technological tradition across hundreds of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers of geography. But the Mousterian is not their only technology. As our understanding of Neanderthal sites has improved, researchers have found evidence of far more varied and sophisticated tool use than was once recognized. Hafted tools, stone points attached to wooden handles with plant-based adhesives, specifically mixtures of birch tar or pine, resin combined with ochre, produced through a multi-step process that required careful temperature control. Producing birch tar requires heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen, a complex, non-obvious chemical process that implies understanding of fire chemistry well beyond simply keeping a flame alive. Wooden tools rarely preserved but occasionally recovered. At a site in Germany, 300,000-year-old wooden spears, the oldest wooden weapons ever found, were recovered from a Neanderthal context. They are not simple pointed sticks. They are carefully shaped, balanced, with the center of gravity deliberately positioned for accurate throwing. The Neanderthals were toolmakers of the first order, not as sophisticated as the Upper Paleolithic modern humans who eventually shared Europe with them, but far, far beyond the primitive image that once Semiting. When we met around 1,000 years, monuments homosexuelle sapiens. Our direct ancestors arrived in Europe for the first time. They had been in the Middle East for longer, possibly in southern Asia for longer still. The exact timing and routes of their expansion out of Africa and across Eurasia is still being refined by ongoing research. But in Europe, the evidence is clear. Modern humans appear in the fossil and archaeological record about 45,000 years ago. At that time, Neanderthals were still there, still living in Europe, as they had been for hundreds of thousands of years. For a period of perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 years, the exact duration is debated. Both species coexisted on the same continent, modern humans moving in, expanding their range. Neanderthals present, holding ground in some areas, perhaps retreating in others. What was that meeting like? We do not know, cannot in any sense. But we can infer some things. They met. The genetics proves it. The DNA of modern non-African humans contains between 1 and 4% Neanderthal ancestry. That DNA got there only one way, through interbreeding. Through children born to mixed-species couples, or at least through encounters that produced offspring. They looked at each other and saw something familiar enough to mate with. That is extraordinary. That is not the meeting of a modern human and a chimpanzee, too. Creatures so different that the idea of offspring is biologically impossible. This was a meeting of two kinds of human beings. Different but not impossibly different, and at least sometimes they found in each other something worth reaching toward. What we took from them. The Neanderthal DNA that lives in modern humans is not randomly distributed across the genome. It is concentrated in certain regions and conspicuously absent from others. The regions where Neanderthal DNA is most common in modern humans include genes related to the immune system particularly. A set of genes called the HLA complex, which helps the immune system recognize and respond to pathogens. This makes beautiful evolutionary sense. The Neanderthals had been in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. They had evolved immune responses to the pathogens of that environment. When modern humans arrived from Africa, they were entering a disease landscape they had never encountered. They had no evolved defenses against the viruses and bacteria of European and Asian ecosystems. But by interbreeding with Neanderthals and incorporating Neanderthal immune genes, they acquired those defenses. Ready-made, refined by hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal pathogen coevolution. Inherited instantly through a single generation of interbreeding. The Neanderthal DNA in modern humans may have saved us, may have been the difference between a successful expansion into Eurasia and a catastrophic die-off from diseases our immune systems couldn't handle. We also appear to have inherited from them genes related to skin and hair characteristics useful in cold climates. Genes affecting how our bodies respond to low temperatures. Adaptations that the Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years refining, and that we acquired through perhaps a few thousand years of interbreeding. We are better equipped for the world we live in part because of them. What we give them. The interbreeding was not one-directional. Analysis of a Neanderthal genome from a site called Vindija Cave in Croatia shows clear evidence of modern human DNA in the Neanderthal genetic sequence. Modern humans contributed genes to the Neanderthal population as well. Some of those genes appear to have been beneficial. At least one version of a gene related to immune function appears to have spread through late Neanderthal populations, possibly because it conferred an advantage against diseases that modern humans were carrying with them from Africa. And here is a sobering thought. Some of those diseases new to the Neanderthal immune system may have contributed to their decline. Modern humans arriving in Europe would have carried pathogens they themselves had some resistance to, childhood diseases. In effect, for our species, but for the Neanderthals encountering these pathogens for the first time. Without the evolved immune response that long exposure produces, those diseases may have been devastating. This is not unique to prehistoric human contact. It is the same dynamic that devastated indigenous American and Pacific Island populations when they were first exposed to European diseases in the 15th through 19th centuries. Populations with no prior exposure to smallpox, measles, and influenza died in catastrophic numbers not because of any failing on their part, but simply because their immune systems had never had the opportunity to adapt. The Neanderthals may have suffered the same fate. Not murdered, not outcompeted in any dramatic, direct sense, but sickened, weakened, their numbers falling, slowly, generation by generation, as new diseases worked through populations that had no defense. The end and after. Why they disappeared. The disappearance of the Neanderthals is one of the most discussed questions in all of paleoanthropology. And the honest answer is that we do not have a single, definitive explanation. What we have is a set of contributing factors, each of which probably played a role. The first factor is population size. The Neanderthal population was never large. Estimates based on genetic diversity suggest that the total Neanderthal population across all of Europe and Western Asia may never have exceeded a few 100,000 individuals and, during difficult periods, may have been far lower. Small populations are vulnerable. A bad stretch of winters, a disease outbreak, a run of unsuccessful hunts, any of these can reduce a small population to a level from which recovery is difficult. The second factor is modern human competition. The arrival of modern humans did not have to involve direct violence, though that certainly may have occurred in some places and times. Even peaceful competition for the same resources can be devastating for the smaller, less numerous group. If modern humans were slightly better at certain aspects of hunting, or had social networks that allowed them to share information and resources over larger areas, or had some other subtle advantage over hundreds of years and dozens of generations, even a small advantage compounds into an enormous difference. The third factor is interbreeding. This is not a cause of disappearance in a simple sense. You do not disappear by having children with another group. But if the Neanderthal population was small, and if substantial numbers of Neanderthals were forming reproductive partnerships with modern humans, then the distinct Neanderthal population could have been absorbed into the larger modern human population over time. Not exterminated, assimilated. The fourth factor, as discussed, is disease. The fifth factor is climate change. Around 40,000 years ago, a period of rapid climate fluctuation began in Europe, temperatures swinging dramatically, ecosystems disrupted. The Neanderthals had survived previous climate changes, but perhaps not in combination with all the other pressures they were now facing simultaneously. The truth is probably all of these things working together over millennia, not a single catastrophe, not a genocide. A slow, complicated, multi-generational process of decline, absorption, and ultimately disappearance as a distinct population. The last Neanderthals. The last known Neanderthals, identified from genetic and fossil evidence, appear to have survived in isolated pockets of southern Europe. particularly in the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, until approximately 40,000 years ago. Some claims push that date to 28,000 years ago, though these are contested. What were they like, these last survivors? We do not know. But the evidence from Gibraltar, one of the last refugia, shows Neanderthals who were resourceful and adaptable, using coastal resources, making art, decorating eagle talons in ways that suggest symbolic significance, surviving in a landscape that was changing around them. And then the evidence stops, the hearths go cold, the tools cease to appear in the sediment layers. The bones are no longer deposited, they are gone. But here is what I want you to hold as you drift towards sleep. The last Neanderthal who ever lived, somewhere in some cave or valley or forest edge, probably in southern Europe. That individual had a mother, had grown up with people who knew their name, or whatever served as a name, had learned to make to nap flint to read the landscape for sempre, had felt cold and hunger and warmth and satisfaction, had looked up at the night sky, the same sky that is above you right now, and seen the same stars. That last Neanderthal died, and their species died with them, or rather merged into ours, becoming part of the river of human life that continues to flow. But they were real, they were hairy, and they mattered. What lives in you? Let me bring this closer. More personal. If you have ancestry from Europe, Asia, or the Americas, if any of your ancestors lived outside of Africa for the past 60,000 years, then you carry Neanderthal DNA right now, in every cell of your body. 1–4% of your genome. Tens of thousands of individual genetic variants, inherited from ancestors who interbred with Neanderthals somewhere in the Middle East or Europe or Asia, somewhere between 60 and 40,000 years ago. That DNA is doing things right now, influencing your immune system, possibly influencing your hair texture, your skin characteristics, your response to cold. A recent study found that some Neanderthal gene variants influence pain sensitivity in modern humans. Another found links to certain aspects of skull shape. You are not purely Homo sapiens. No one with Eurasian ancestry is. You are a blend, a mixture. The product not just of the modern humans who walked out of Africa, but of the ancient, cold-adapted, Ice Age-tested people who were already here when they arrived. The Neanderthals are not gone. They live in you, carried forward across 40,000 years of human generations. Their adaptations to cold and disease and the particular character of Eurasian environments. Still useful, still present, still functioning in your body as you lie here in the warmth and quiet of tonight. When you feel at home in cold weather, you might be feeling something Neanderthal. When your immune system fights off a virus, some of the tools it uses may be Neanderthal tools, refined across hundreds of thousands of years of Ice Age living. They are part of you. And you are, in a small but real and measurable way, part of them. What we now know. The revolution in understanding. In 2010, a research team led by Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for this work, published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. It was one of the most remarkable scientific achievements in the history of paleoanthropology. Extracting DNA from 50,000-year-old bones is extraordinarily difficult. The DNA is fragmented, degraded, contaminated with bacterial DNA and with modern human DNA from every researcher who has ever handled the specimens. The technical challenges were immense, but Pääbo and his team solved them. And what they found changed our understanding of human prehistory forever. the interbreeding, the shared ancestry, the flow of genes between Neanderthals and modern humans. All of it written in the DNA, clear and unmistakable once you knew how to read it. Since 2010, the field has moved extraordinarily fast. We now have high-quality genome sequences from multiple Neanderthal individuals. We know things about specific Neanderthals, their hair color, their blood type, their disease susceptibilities. They're family relationships that we know about no other extinct species. A family from a site called Chagirskaya Cave in Siberia, a father, an adolescent daughter, and several more distant relatives all living at the same time. Their genomes preserving a snapshot of a specific Neanderthal family from 54,000 years ago. We know they were related. We know something of their social structure. We can read the story of their genes like a family album. The Neanderthals, once so mysterious and so misrepresented, are becoming known to us in ways that would have seemed impossible even 30 years ago. What we still don't know. And yet the mysteries remain. We do not know why it disappeared. The theories are plausible but not proven. We do not know what their language sounded like, or how complex it was, or what stories they told. We do not know what their social structures were like in detail, whether they had chiefs or elders or egalitarian decision-making or something else entirely. We do not know what their spiritual life was like, whether they had beliefs about death and what came after. Whether the burials we find represent ritual and belief or simply practical disposal of remains. We do not know the full extent of their art because art on organic materials, wood, skin, bark, does not preserve across 50,000 years. And only the most durable art on cave walls or in stone has survived. We do not know what songs they sang, if they sang. We do not know if they danced. And we do not know, we can never know, what it was like to be one of them. To see the world through those heavy-browed eyes, to feel the weight of that powerful body. To know the landscape with the intimacy of a species that had been living in it for 400,000 years. These mysteries are not failures of science. They are simply the nature of deep time. The past recedes beyond a certain point into irretrievable silence. What we can do is push the point of silence further and further back, with better techniques, more careful analysis, more open-minded interpretation. And what we find every time we push further back is more complexity, more humanity, more of ourselves looking back at us from the ancient darkness, coming back to now, the faces we almost recognize. I want to end with an image, a thought experiment, really. Imagine you could somehow step back in time, not to ancient Rome or medieval Europe. Those worlds would feel alien enough, but much further, to 50,000 years ago, to Europe in the last ice age. And imagine that around a fire in the entrance of a rock shelter, you saw a group of Neanderthals. What would you feel? Fear, perhaps. They are different from you. Recognizably so. The heavy brows, the projecting face, the sheer physical power of those bodies. But also, and I believe this genuinely, recognition. Something in the way they hold themselves around the fire. The way the adults watch the children. The way hands move when they communicate. The way someone laughs, or whatever their equivalent of laughter was. The way an elder instructs a young person in how to hold a flint. And the young person frowns with concentration and tries again. You would see people, complicated, intelligent, social caring people. People with habits and preferences and relationships and knowledge and fears and hopes. People who were not so different from the people sitting around fires on every continent tonight. People who are, in a measurable biological sense, part of the ancestry of many of those people. The gulf between us and the Neanderthals is real. They were a different species, but the gulf between them and us is very much smaller than the gulf between either of us and our common ancestor, the mysterious archaic human that gave rise, in different places and over different timescales, to both the Neanderthals and to us. We are a family, dist family, but family, the night sky they watched. The stars above you tonight are the same stars the Neanderthals watched, the same moon that illuminates your room or wood. On a clear night, lit the entrances of their caves and the paths they walked between hunting grounds and camps. The same sun that warms you warmed them, rising and setting over an ice age landscape that no longer exists. Warming bodies that were powerfully different from yours and yet animated by the same fundamental biochemistry. The same carbon and hydrogen and oxygen assembled into the same proteins, powered by the same cellular machinery. 400,000 years of Neanderthal history. Of winters survived and children raised and fires kept burning and knowledge passed on. Of illness tended and grief carried and the small daily dignities of a life lived in full presence with the natural world. And then, the end. Quiet, complicated, spread across millennia. Not extinction exactly, absorption, becoming part of the river. Becoming, in some small percentage, you, drift now. Let all of this settle now, gently, like ash after a fire. Let the images soften, the ice age, landscape, the hunting party, the old man by the fire who couldn't chew. Being fed by the people who loved him. Let them become quiet and distant, like a dream you are moving toward rather than a memory you are leaving behind. You are warm, you are safe. The night is around you, dark and still and full of the same ancient silence that surrounded every human and every near-human who has ever lain down to sleep since the first fires were lit. There is a Neanderthal in you, ancient and cold-adapted and 400,000 years patient. Part of your immune system, part of your cells, part of the long biological story that produced the specific, irreplaceable person that is you. That part of you has survived everything. Ice ages, near extinction, species boundaries. The 40,000 years since the last Neanderthal looked up at these stars. You come from deep time. You carry it in your cells. Let that be the last thought before sleep takes you. Not a weight, a gift, the weight of all that survival, held lightly. The gift of all those lives, folded into yours. Breathe slowly now. Let your body be heavy and warm. Let the darkness be friendly. The Neanderthals kept their fires burning for 400,000 years. Yours can rest tonight. Sleep well.